We are back here in part 2 with Melanie Perkins McLaughlin to speak about the disappearance of her childhood friend, Andy Puglisi. And Andy disappeared from a swimming pool in Lawrence, Massachusetts on August 22nd, 1976. Melanie has done extensive work on his disappearance, and it's extremely impressive. And as we introduce the second part of this conversation, just want to remind you to listen to part 1 if you haven't yet, because we jump right into the topic of networks of pedophiles. So it's right into the middle of this story.
Right. And unfortunately, that's just where the story takes us. We don't want to be talking about missing 10-year-olds and pedophiles, but it's hard to avoid that, especially with the information that she's brought to us. She's done an incredible job with this investigation. You'll hear more of our thoughts in our final thoughts. I said at the top of the intro of the first episode of this just how important the work she's done is. And if anyone hasn't listened to part 1, yes, like you said, please go back and listen to part 1. And we also said that we just needed to give it a breather in between the two parts. So hopefully everybody's ready for part 2 here.
Yes, and make sure to check out Melanie's excellent podcast called Open Investigation. And she mentions in the second part here that she's got a season 2 that's coming soon to Open Investigation. So we'll have Melanie back on once that is out. I'd love to get deeper into that topic. And also, Melanie's got a great documentary out there. The documentary is called Have You Seen Andy? And she mentions that she's currently looking for new distribution for the documentary, but it is an Emmy Award-winning documentary, Lance. It's actually really excellent as well.
It is excellent. And again, I got some thoughts on the idea of making a documentary about this, and get into that again during our final thoughts. But if you want more info on Have You Seen Andy and the story behind it, Melanie's story behind it, there is a website, haveyouseenandy.com. And you can check out where to watch it, and you can get some history and background on the team behind it.
Okay, thanks a lot for listening. Please follow us on social media at Missing CSM. We're going to break real quick for commercial here, and we'll be right back with Melanie Perkins McLaughlin. Now, obviously, that's not shocking to you at this point. It seems like that pedophiles will, they have their own networks like that. But that is so disturbing for someone who is, further outside of that to understand and realize. How the heck does that happen?
Generational abuse, I would say, and systemic neglect, combination of all of those things. I think that, when I talk about, people who have been, abusing people. And, I also hear from survivors, of course, who have been like, I was abused as a child and I never did that. And they can't reconcile themselves with saying, and I get it, I'm not making excuses for anybody and what they do. But what I do know is that, not every child who was abused becomes an abuser, but every abuser was abused. So it is generational. It is systemic. There's lots of, neglect in our foster care system. And that was the other thing I found out, that like all these foster kids were being trafficked in the 1970s. And it was like legitimately a task force investigation was created because a foster child died under suspicious circumstances. And so they created a task force investigation with the Attorney General, the Boston Police, and the Department of Public Works to investigate. The last newspaper article says 5,000 foster care homes with 3,000 placements to see how many children were actually being trafficked by this social worker who had been trafficking children to pedophiles. And there was a task force created, and nobody seems to know where that task force report is. There's not a trace of this task force report. It's just incredible. And then people will say, oh, it was the 70s. That was almost 50 years ago. It's like, give me a break.
Come on. Like, stop it. Like, they figured out Watergate in the 70s. Like,
exactly.
Just because it's the 70s doesn't mean people are completely inept. Like, that's
Thank you.
Ridiculous.
I don't know if you guys can hear this rain. So if people in the background are wondering what that noise is, we're getting rain on our ceiling here. So just FYI.
I got the same noise happening here, so all good.
But yeah, I appreciate that, Lance. It's true. It's like they can figure things out all the time, but I think the thing that's important is people like, well, why would I want to listen to this podcast? This sounds really heavy. Why do I want to do this? And it's like, because when we don't, that is systemic neglect. That is choosing to ignore. And when we choose to ignore, the systems don't change and the patterns continue to be repeated. And someday it might be your child or your grandchild because we're not paying attention. And so we need to listen to these things. And, if there are things that are too hard to listen to, fast forward and listen to the rest or whatever. But there are things that we need to listen to. And to be clear, I do in the podcast, I had a survivor who shares this story about going to a Catholic school, and she was involved in the swim team, and the swim coach there was a pedophile priest who, was accused of abusing many children there. And initially she told her story and we edited it, and I sort of didn't get into, I was traumatized the first time I heard her story, and I'm sure she was retelling it. And I know, continues to be, and, has gotten help, and I've gotten help, all of those things. It's important not to do these things without professional support as well. And that's why we include that in the podcast too. But I had edited the story. I gave her the first right of listen, right? Like I was like first right of refusal because I thought that was the right thing to do. She's sharing this story. I want to make sure that A, that I get the facts right, and B, that she agrees with what I'm sharing on the podcast. So I shared the cut with her. And she actually came back to me, and the podcast was already out. A couple of episodes had already been released. And she came back to me and she said, I want you to edit it and tell the whole story. And I was like, really? And she said, I do. I want you to edit it and tell the whole story. It's really important for me that people hear what really happened in this basement, which was essentially a gang rape, with a priest and another child and another adult. And it was just horrible. And so we did, we went back there and we warned people beforehand, and we tell them to fast forward if they can't listen or whatever. But it was really empowering for her afterwards, to know that his name had been spoken, that it was public, that, exactly the details of what he did. And the details are out there. They're on Bishop Accountability. These affidavits exist. It's not like, you're, digging through people's trauma too to find out what happened. I mean, it's all there. It's all documented. Just people choose not to talk about it a lot of times. And my position is we have to talk about it.
Yeah. And I'm sure some people will say, well, what can I do about this? And you're not asking, and we're not asking anybody to go do anything. You can do what you want to do with it. You can take it as far as you want to take it. But the only thing that we would like someone to take from hearing a conversation like that is to suddenly have this awareness that it exists in the world and it exists in your community, and keep your eyes peeled for it. And if you see something, then you need to, alert the right people to any sort of suspicious behavior like that.
Yeah, I think it's really important awareness, but I also do hope that people will do things, about it. And the other thing is
same,
that, yeah. And I mean, I've had a lot of survivors contact me. I mean, one of the things that actually got me through making the podcast, because it takes a toll to tell these stories as well on the person that's producing and sharing the content. So while I was making the podcast, though, the thing that really got me through was reading the reviews on Apple Podcasts. And there were so many people that would write in and that would say how much this helped them, or how they didn't even identify what had really happened to them, but this is something that helped them do that. And, that was really rewarding. And we talk about, the last episode is about advocacy and a call to action and things that people can do. But we also interviewed Dr. Judith Herman, who talks about how truth telling and, being able to share your story is really empowering for victims, and that they see victims heal as a result of that. For those who are able, there are some that aren't able. There are some that have died through substance abuse and other means because they couldn't bear to, deal with what they had endured, and understandably. And then there are some that are able to go to the State House and testify, like, Billy Giblin, who, just was at the State House again, testifying for an end to the statute of limitations on child sex abuse. I mean, the fact that, he was abused by a priest, but there's nothing that can be done about it because the statute of limitations is over and the priest is still practicing and is still around children. I mean, it is just mind-boggling. And those are the systemic failures. So when people are like, why are you doing it? It's like, I'm also trying to expose systemic failures, because those are how we fix them. And when we talk about laws and how things changed, in legislative advocacy, it's like the Jacob Wetterling Act created the sex offender program to sex offender a status program to know where sex offenders are, and other things like Amber Alert, and that Megan's Law. I mean, all of these things make the world safer for our children, and so knowing. But also, we see a lot of abuse in schools. I'm on a board of an organization called Enough Abuse Mass Kids, and they are the oldest organization for CSA prevention in Massachusetts. And they do a lot of work around outreach and change and systemic change and helping survivors and what have you. But what we see a lot is abuse in schools, and that's not talked about, right? Like that people don't talk about that enough. And the problem in schools is that a lot of times they're doing, and I was just recently, I served a couple of terms on school committee, and I'm not talking necessarily about my own school district or what have you, but what happens with a lot of school districts is that, something will happen in the school where was inappropriate or more than inappropriate, criminal. And oftentimes what will happen is the schools will do exactly what the Catholic Church did, was they'll give the person the option of leaving without criminal prosecution. And then the person can pick up and go and get a job in another school district. And it's just systemic. It just continues because the school doesn't want the negative press, right? The parents don't want to press charge. I mean, a whole bunch of reasons. But so one of the things that this Enough Abuse organization offers is training for staff around what grooming looks like, right? To know, like, okay, if there's a teacher and they're giving a child gifts and they're driving the child home and or a janitor or anybody, I'm not implying that, teachers do that. I want to be really clear. Like, I'm not accusing anybody here either. I'm just saying to be able to be aware, like you were saying, Lance, about keeping your eyes open. And so when you see these kinds of things, when, somebody takes a special interest in a kid who, maybe doesn't have parents that are looking out for them, and maybe is an immigrant from another country and doesn't, and they're sort of spending a lot of time with that person, maybe even over their house a lot, or whatever. It could be nothing, but it could be not. And that is blending lines, and that can be what's called grooming. And so people really need to be aware, and it's important work.
It's so infuriating.
Yeah, no kidding.
It's infuriating, and it is extremely important work, and we appreciate what you and your team are doing with the podcast and, of course, with the documentary as well. And I guess I got to ask, is, pedophilia and the idea of conspiracy, going all the way up to the top these days, is that news story annoying to you? Or are you like, oh, well, at least people are understanding that there are networks and conspiracies that go along with this?
It's annoying in one sense because it's a very easy way to dismiss the truth, right, about what's going on. And I think that actually it can be weaponized against people who are trying to show that there's the truth. And it's a way that, it's kind of like right out of the playbook of like accuse other people of what, you're guilty of or whatever. It's kind of that playbook. It's like, oh, that's just conspiracy theory, or that's just, and I think that there are conspiracy theories out there that are way off base and that are just entirely, awful. And sometimes there's some shred of truth in them that it came from somewhere, right? So that you have to sort of dig deeper and see what the facts are. And that's why the podcast is so fact driven and data based, because I want to make sure, and trauma informed, because I want to make sure, when I was trying to pitch the podcast to people, I think that's part of the reason that it wasn't picked up by distributors, is because people automatically assume that, oh my God, that sounds like conspiracy theory, that sounds like whatever. And it's like, no, there was a system of human trafficking of children in the 1970s, and it's in America, and it's well documented. And not only that, my childhood friend is missing and was likely a part of that system. And I'm going to speak about it, and, and I'm going to show you how and why. And then you can tell me whether you believe it or not. Listen to the 9 episodes of the podcast and tell me whether you think that that's real or not. And I think nobody can listen to that podcast and come back and say, hey, this wasn't happening. There's nobody that could do that. You just can't refute it because it is so fact-based, which is why I'm an investigative journalist and a documentary filmmaker. And that's why I had the training that I had. And I'm so glad that I did before I made the podcast, because I know facts matter and truth matters. And the way that you prove things is you show them, like you prove it through not artificial intelligence, through documents, through research, through evidence-based practices. And so that's what we did. And that's what we'll continue to do. And I have to say, season 2 is coming up soon. And what we found in season 1 of Open Investigation was, what I was finding was that Andy's story was beyond Andy, right? Like that there were other children. We thought Andy's case was an anomaly. We thought as kids that this was rare. I thought it was rare, and then later we started, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children opened, and we started to see images on milk cartons. And then there was some people were becoming more aware of it, but didn't understand. And the truth is stranger abductions are rare, but child sex abuse is not, you know what I mean? And so it happens all the time. And so if there's 1 in 4, they say 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 8 or 1 in 10 boys, depending on, what you're reading. And even the boys we think are more, it's just, they're less likely to report. And so I think, okay, if you have that data and you're in a room, you're in a party, you look around, 1 in 4 girls, 1 in 8 boys has been sexually abused. You're like, wow, that's really incredible. But then take the next step and say, if 1 in 4 girls are abused and 1 in 8 boys are abused, how many pedophiles does that make? A lot.
All right, we're going to take a quick break for commercial. And just a reminder, folks, that we will return at the end of this conversation with some final thoughts.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
There's a lot more of this than people want to recognize or acknowledge. And I just want to say, if there are people out there that have experienced CSA, you're not alone. We believe you. There's help out there for you. There's, RAIN, the organization RAIN is a great resource. I hope, Lance and Tim, you'll mention that, and some other organizations I can give you off the top. I'm not thinking of them right now, but that people know where to go for help. But what I ended up finding out, that Andy's case was not as rare as I had hoped. I learned through data and through realizing that data tells its own story, that I started to put together a spreadsheet of missing and murdered children from the 1970s, because, I knew based on what I was seeing from these men that were committing these crimes, that some of the children had to have been murdered and had died. And so I thought, well, if there was evidence of a body, then, because we're always hearing, oh, Andy's case couldn't be prosecuted because there was no body, no crime. That's what they would say all the time. So then I was like, all right, well, there had to be bodies, right? So there had to be some bodies. So let me look at, this hypothesis I had, where could some of the murdered children potentially be connected to some of the missing children? And, let me see how many children were murdered in this decade and how many are unsolved, right? And so I started to put together this list, and I was like, just blown away with the data. And at this point, we have 27 and counting missing and murdered children from Massachusetts alone in the 1970s. These are children. I'm not talking about other missing. These are children, which I qualify as 18 and under, or, maybe 19. I think one of them's 19 and under, missing and murdered children whose cases remain unsolved in Massachusetts. And when I say 27 and counting, that's because we don't know about runaways who weren't reported. Like we just had the case, you guys probably know about Anthony Ray, right? Like the case of the Newberry Doe. So, we had been advocating for some time for those remains to be tested. So in early 1990s, actually, Dr. Myers worked on this case. A skeleton was recovered in Newberry on the Newburyport line, which is in the Merrimack Valley, which is where Andy disappeared. So I became very interested in the skeleton, right? Because we knew it was a boy, and we knew it was about 15, which was a little bit older than when Andy disappeared. But I still wanted to know, could this be Andy? And if there are people out there who have missing loved ones, please know that there are ways that you can find this information out. And one of the ways is you can have your DNA. You can use something like 23andMe is something that goes right and connects to another database called GEDmatch, which law enforcement uses this GEDmatch database to do comparisons of unidentified remains against people who were in the database, like an aunt, a cousin, whatever. And that's essentially how they figured out who this little boy was, or teenage boy was. And his name was Anthony Ray. And he was a 15-year-old who had gone missing. And supposedly, and he was in a school for emotionally disturbed children, not a surprise, right? Another sort of system that can really abuse, kids. And we found that a lot of kids, he was in foster care, a lot of kids in foster care, like we were saying. And he had been reported missing by his school, but it's unclear to who he was reported missing, because he was never a NCMEC as far as we could find, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. So this boy went unreported all these years. Nobody knew who these remains were. And finally, he has a name, and he's been given that, and, his family has been made aware, and he's been returned, essentially, if you will, to his identity. But all that time he was unknown. And so that makes me wonder how many of those are out there, right? And there's another girl, Denise Cochran from Brockton, and, Denise is one that stays with me all the time. Her story haunts me. And, her family is still local and they're still around, and they've been less involved with, social media and stuff, because sometimes they get hounded by people too that are just supposedly, victim advocates or true crime people that are, saying they're authentic, but I think are not, and really just out to exploit. Unfortunately, there are those people out there as well. But, in Denise Cochran's case, she was a girl from the 70s, and she was 11, and she went missing, and her parents advocated for the police to do something initially. They said she was a runaway. She had some problems at home, and they didn't do a lot initially. But the parents tried to advocate, didn't get very far. This was in Brockton. And a year after this little girl disappears, her skeletonized remains come tumbling out of this electric casing in a junkyard. Okay. In a electrical yard. And they're identified, mom identifies her, I believe, based on what she was wearing. And so they're identified as Denise Cochran. But, I started to, one of the things I do to get information too, is I had looked for Denise's death certificate. And because Denise was not in the data. So there's DPH collects data for vital statistics for recovered bodies, or, for any death. There's a date for, the day you're born and the day you die, there's data. There should be data. Denise wasn't in the data, right? So I had gone to the DPH and I gotten, 1970s data, give me all the data of, not even just homicides, all death data. Give me all of that. I'll sort through homicides and others to see if there's things that I'm missing and call this data, which is what I did as part of my research. And Denise wasn't in that. And I was like, how is this girl not in this? Because I knew about her because I had been, doing some research online in the newspaper. And I went and I pulled her death certificate, and it was left blank. Like the reason for death was left blank. But even that, she should have still been in this statistic. She's not in the statistic. And sadly, like they wrote, she was found in an electrical yard where there's like these big drums, her body was in there, and she had a crushed skull like many of these children did. They wrote on the death certificate, found in junkyard. It was just like so callous and like so heartbreaking. And it's still incredibly heartbreaking to me today. And Denise's case remains unsolved. And how does an 11-year-old girl go missing for a year? Her skeleton is found with a crushed skull, and it's not called a homicide or foul play or investigated. So Denise is in this limbo state where she's not identified as a homicide per se. I think she was subsequently, but they didn't go back and repair the death certificate. So she just got lost in the data, and I wonder how many of those there are. So, but season 2 is called 27 and Counting. And we are going to be sharing the stories of these 27 missing and murdered children whose cases remain unsolved to this day. And our goal is to get some of them solved, whether it's through public awareness and getting the cold case unit involved. So that's another thing we did. We advocated for a cold case unit, and the Mass State Police, Dr. Myers and I advocated heavily for that, as did others. And we were very happy, when Colonel Carrie Gilpin was in charge. She was the colonel of the state police. She also happens to be the sibling of a murdered sister whose case remains unsolved. And so she really understood the dilemma, and I think worked really hard to create the unresolved case unit at the Mass State Police, which exists today. And we're very proud of that. And we work closely with them to try to help families get their cases worked on, because unfortunately there's far too many of them.
When you have season 2 that's out, even like around the time that it's coming out, please come back on and go through.
Oh, I will. It's coming out soon.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Lance.
You're more than welcome to come back on. I mean, it's incredible work that you're doing.
It is incredible work, and there is no end to this conversation. So, you are more than welcome to come back.
Yes.
I know.
Thank you. And Tim, like I said, and in Lance, it's true. It's like there is no end, because we're still in the 1970s. We haven't touched the 80s, 90s, 2010, none of that. And so for researchers out there, I know that there are some grad students that have contacted me that are looking at different decades. I think that's great. I think they should be doing that. I think the 70s are unique because it was before there were any systems in place, right? So there was no National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. And there was not a lot of crime tracking for, children. There wasn't even, like I said, a law against child exploitation. Or interestingly, there was no law against abducting a boy and taking him across state line. But it was illegal to do that for a girl, but it wasn't illegal for a boy. I mean, it's crazy, the things that you don't even believe are true. But that was the 70s, which was just like the vogue. And I think in really sort of the height, or I don't know if it was the height with the internet now, I'm sure there's a lot as well, but it was the booming era for child exploitation. And it really was taking off at that point. And they were really figuring out how to systemize and work to, and I think that it's just gotten better with the internet and, ways to communicate across. And I think that law enforcement would agree on that. And so there is no way to necessarily stop it, but if we don't try, and, even one child, obviously it makes a difference. So we do what we can in any way that we can. And I would also say for the 1970s, I think that if you had somebody in each state in the 1970s, they could duplicate the data that I did and they would see the same thing. Because the reason that the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children was created was because it's literally documented, because there was a spate of missing children across the country. And I think that in every single state, you would find the same to be true. And how interconnected those things are, I have no idea. And do I think all 27 cases are connected? No. But I do think there's some really important data there. There's more than a dozen that are all crushed skull. I mean, that's compelling to me, right? And part of the problem is that there was no comparison data, right? These law enforcement agencies weren't necessarily sharing information across 350 different police stations. But now with, the means that we have, we can do that. And we're just trying to raise as much public awareness as we can. And people say, what does justice look like to you today, Melanie? What would you want? I would want a task force investigation looking at these 27 unsolved cases of missing and murdered children in Massachusetts. That's what I want.
It's not too much to ask.
One that doesn't go missing after 50 years.
Right. Well, yeah, because what are they going to say? Well, come on, it's the 2020s.
Yeah, right.
What do you expect?
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
In 2070, they'll be like, oh, it's 2020. They didn't know how to do that. Yeah.
They didn't know that stuff back then. Yeah. Well, I'm glad we could have a moment where we can laugh, because this is a very heavy topic, and you do such a great job in advocating and also working on it. And I think part of the proof of you doing a good job is answering that question, what does justice look like? And a lot of times you'll hear people give, and I'm not putting fault on anybody, but your answer of well, I want a task force. I want a task force that's proactive. And I mean, that is good. It's not well, I just want the families to feel closure. That's so abstract. You want something that's I want boots on the ground here. There are concrete things you can do. You can advocate with your legislators to get a grand jury investigation of all 4 dioceses in Massachusetts to look historically at what was happening to children in the diocese, because it was systemic and there was coordinated abuse. And, again, if we don't know that, we can't change it moving forward. And again, to be clear, it's not just the Catholic Church. There are lots of systems that can be used for abuse, as we know, Boy Scouts, gymnastics, any kind of organized system that has children that are vulnerable, and it can be manipulated. So we have to be able to do what we can to try to raise awareness around those things. So I really appreciate folks listening. You can reach out again to your legislators and make change. You can talk to family members that experience CSA. You can start to have the conversation. You can start to identify what safety looks like. There's lots of things that can be done, but we appreciate you listening. That's the first thing.
All right, we are back here for final thoughts after the conversation with Melanie. Lance, she has done some incredible work on the disappearance of her childhood friend, Andy Puglisi, but even wider than that, just shedding light on this issue of pedophilia and networks of pedophilia. We speak about people being abused, children being abused, and other grown men there taking pictures. This is a disturbing topic, Lance, and as we talk about in the conversation, there's really no end to this topic.
Unfortunately, right? I mean, we're talking about disappearance and all of the factors that go around this disappearance. Public pool, 10-year-old. I mean, there's a lot of kids that frequented this pool in that area in Lawrence, and I don't know the age range, but, you can probably guess anywhere from like 6 years old to 17, 18, whatever. But it's like adolescence there. And I'd love to say that after almost 50 years, there's been some proper education and some counseling or some sort of movement in a progressive way to stop this, what I don't know if I'm using systemic correctly, but it feels like this problem that is just always been embedded in society for years. I mean, this is half a century old, and even today we're still talking about things like this. I mean, this could be happening. This is happening today still. There's not enough. Yes, definitely. There's not enough proper treatment for people who have these urges. There's not enough understanding with the victims who suffer this, the people who survive these attacks. Yeah, we'd have to call them attacks. I mean, people who are survivors of sexual assault and pedophilia. Unfortunately, we'll never know that with Andy unless some miraculous thing happens after 50 years, but he's still missing, and there's still all these questions. So good for Melanie. I mean, this is a really hard story to tackle regardless of who it is, but it's her childhood friend. So that just makes it even more emotional for her and for the people who know the story and know her.
Yeah, her story is sad of knowing this boy, her friend, someone she said she had a crush on at 10 years old, and she was with him the day he disappeared. And public pools, Lance, that is something that is a bit shocking to hear. She says that there were at least 5 pedophiles, known pedophiles, at the pool that day. That is wild to me. As someone who used to frequent public pools in Massachusetts, Stoneham, I used to go to the Stoneham pool with my family. But now, it's kind of obvious to, think back that there were very likely pedophiles there too. And probably at every public pool, now that I'm thinking about it. I mean, if there were 5 in one area, why would there not be some at other pools, unless they're just so coordinated that they were there at the same time intentionally? I don't know why this wouldn't be widespread. And the other thing is, you mentioned awareness for this issue. Not only do we lack awareness these days, there is a push from the other side of this to normalize it. The NAMBLA Association, Melanie goes into this in her podcast. We didn't get too deep into that, or I don't think that, NAMBLA came up at all in our conversation with Melanie. But in her podcast, Open Investigation, she goes well deep into that and speaks about the creation of that from Massachusetts. I think Revere.
I was not aware, again, until hearing that information that it was Revere. And Revere, Massachusetts is right outside of Boston, for people who are not aware. It used to be a hot vacation destination for everybody, for people in that community, for socialites. There was a Ferris wheel there, and then it took a downturn in the economy, and it is, I guess, on the way back up. But for a long period of time, there was... It wasn't known as the cleanest, most inviting beach in Massachusetts. And I did not realize that the NAMBLA organization, which I don't want to insult other organizations by calling it that, but for those who don't know, don't Google it. It stands for the North American Man-Boy Love Association. I have a memory of my friend who went to Berklee College of Music back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we would visit him in Boston from time to time, and I have a memory of going into a bookstore and seeing a periodical, like a little paper magazine, something that was self-published by NAMBLA, on the shelf in the bookstore. It wasn't anything that was issued to the bookstore. Like, the bookstore didn't order a bunch of these like they would like People magazine or something. It was obvious that someone had like a stack of them and just slipped it on the shelf, right? And we ripped them up. I didn't even look at it. I remember with my friend looking at it and being like, what is this? And I remember like tearing one up in my hands and being like, this is disgusting. So that was in like the early 2000s. So talk about normalizing.
Yeah, it's a tough topic. We've never talked about this topic, even though we've covered child abductions and likely sexual assaults even recently with Holly Perinian We've covered the disappearances of Jack and Lily Sullivan, several others recently. Emmanuel Haro we're covering. So, a lot of child cases lately. Obviously, John Benet Ramsey, we've covered her case as well. So really, this story of pedophilia is more mixed into these stories than we've actually ever spoken about, which is kind of odd to think about, but it's true. It's likely because it's so disturbing to think that this is just normalized by a group of people. And really, it's child abuse and it's sexual abuse, and it can very easily lead to murder. And it seems to have in Andy's case and many kids.
Yeah. Would you ever take your kids to a public pool?
I don't know. I guess I never have, but now I would have to think about it. I mean, we go to a lake or the beach, the ocean. So it's not probably too much different than that.
What? But my point is, what are you supposed to do? Shelter everybody because of this?
Yeah. No, I think it's awareness. Yeah.
Yeah, it's awareness. It's been going on for generations, and awareness. You need to be aware, and I don't know what they have to do when someone gets on a sex registry list, when someone's registered as a sex offender, especially somebody who has these types of feelings towards young children. If you're on a sex offender list and you specifically are targeting young children, is there a way for there to be mandated therapy sessions? Is there something? Can you be rehabilitated? Can you be reformed? Are you able to exist in public and control your urges? Maybe you're not going to be cured, but maybe you're not going to go and abduct a kid. Maybe there's a balance here that we can maintain.
And also in the conversation, Melanie mentions that 1 out of 4 girls have been sexually abused, and 1 out of 8 or 1 out of 10 boys, these are underage kids we're talking about, have been sexually abused. So again, it's this topic that is so disturbing and not really spoken about much these days. And, we did briefly kind of touch on this topic hitting politics in 2025. With Melanie, we didn't really name any names or anything, but, you probably have to be under a rock to not know where what I was talking about with this. But yeah, I mean, it's proven there are networks of pedophiles out there, and the mainstream media is covering this to some degree, or at least covering that to some degree. It's, mostly politically motivated, it seems, but at least it's out there to some degree.
Yes, exactly. My hope is that the coverage of what is happening today, and Epstein had an island that he flew people, this isn't up for debate. He had an island that he flew powerful people out to in order to have rendezvous with underage individuals, were flown to his island. He had a whole island. And on the topic of powerful people, and I think this is why it's almost kind of normalized, and I hate saying it, but the CEO of Victoria's Secret, Les Wexner, was an associate of Epstein. And there was a brand of Victoria's Secret that everyone's familiar with. It's called Pink. And that Pink brand was marketed and designed for younger women, for adolescent women. And there's an incredible documentary about this. And it was known that Epstein would attend the runway shows for the Pink brand. And that's where I'm going to leave that. So you have a billionaire CEO of a women's clothing brand that specialized in lingerie and underwear, developing a product for younger women called Pink that Epstein was right in the middle of. So that's what, when you're saying it's normalized and we're talking about powerful people and what's happening today, these are all facts.
It's out in the open.
It's out in the open. It's written on the backside of the clothing. And actually, my sister had sweatpants that said it, and I was and I gave her the history of it. I'm pretty sure she burned them. I don't know, but she no longer wears them. But that's what it is. When you put that brand on something and you've branded this name and it's now part of the popular culture, it's normalized. And I'll stop preaching, but that's how we get to this point where you have to fight so hard to say this isn't normal. This isn't right. You can't say it is.
And obviously, you know, there are many murders and disappearances at the center of these networks. And Andy Puglisi is not forgotten by us here and not by Melanie Perkins McLaughlin. So make sure to check out her documentary. It will be streaming again soon. Again, it's Emmy Award winning. It's excellent. And her podcast is also excellent. It's called Open Investigation. Make sure to check that out. And it goes deep into all these things that we're discussing here now. And we will have Melanie back. And if you've got any comments on this, please leave them on Spotify or YouTube. Make sure to like and subscribe, and please share.
Yes, please share. And if you have a story like Melanie's, if you have a passion for filmmaking, Melanie is a great example of having the story, wanting to tell it, making the documentary. And it's not about winning an Emmy. It's not about the award. It's the fact that that elevates this documentary to the point where more eyes can see it. You can do it. You can absolutely put that together and do it if you have the story and you have the passion to tell it like she did. And the fact that happened to her because she had that passion and because she wanted to tell the story and open up this dialogue, if you have that too, if you have even half of that, you can do this. The more those stories are told, the better.
All right, everyone. Thank you very much for listening. We really appreciate it. We'll be back next week with more new episodes.